It was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. My wife had just come home after months of serving overseas. And instead of going straight to the city, we decided to spend a few weeks at my quiet cabin in the mountains. It was a place I'd built with my own hands, a peaceful retreat surrounded by tall pines. It's the kind of spot where you could hear the wind more than you could hear cars. We thought it would be the perfect place for her to rest, recover, and just breathe again. But apparently, peace and privacy weren't on the agenda for our neighbor. If you've ever dealt with a controlling HOA member, you know exactly the type. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood rules, watching, always ready to pounce on anything she thought didn't fit her perfect little picture. Around here, folks called her Karen, and honestly, it wasn't. Far from the truth, the first couple of days went by without incident. My wife loved the cabin, especially the porch swing overlooking the lake. But then, one afternoon, Karen showed up at the property line, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, like she was about to inspect a crime scene. She demanded to know who my wife was and why she was moving in without HOA approval. Before I could even respond, she pulled out her phone and started calling the cops, mumbling something about unauthorized occupancy and community security. I couldn't believe it. My wife, fresh out of military service, being treated like she was some kind of trespasser on my own property. I asked Karen to calm down, but she wouldn't listen. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a patrol car appeared at the end of the road, and the whole situation went from irritating to surreal. What happened next? Well, let's just say Karen's confident smirk didn't last long. The moment she saw the small leather wallet my wife pulled from her jacket, her face changed completely. And that was just the beginning of the shock she was about to get. The officer stepped out of the car, his expression calm but curious as he glanced between Karen, who was still clutching her phone, and my wife, who stood quietly with her military ID in hand. The late afternoon sun caught the shine of the badge inside the wallet, and for a brief moment, there was complete silence. Karen's voice, which had been sharp and commanding just seconds earlier, suddenly faltered. You see, my wife isn't someone who brags about her service. In fact, most people in the neighborhood didn't even know she was in the military. She's always been humble, the kind of person who would rather listen than talk about herself. But after months overseas, all she wanted was a place where she could feel safe and at home. That's why we came to the cabin, away from the noise, the stress, and the endless demands of the outside world. The officer took the ID, looked it over, and then glanced back at Karen with an eyebrow raised. Ma'am, this is a lawful resident, he said evenly. But instead of apologizing, Karen crossed her arms and started listing supposed violations of HOA guidelines, things like an unapproved occupant, an unsightly truck in the driveway, and even the American flag hanging from our porch. I could see the frustration building in my wife's eyes, but she stayed calm, letting Karen dig herself deeper. What Karen didn't realize was that the cabin was on my private property, and the HOA's reach didn't actually extend as far as she thought. Still, I could tell this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. Karen had a way of turning small disputes into full-blown battles, and this time, she'd picked the wrong target. Because my wife wasn't just going to stand there and let someone question her right to be here. And the next word she spoke would leave everyone stunned, including me. Karen's smug expression had all but vanished. But she was still clinging to her argument like a dog with a bone. The officer, clearly trying to keep the peace, glanced at me for some explanation. I could feel my jaw tightening as I told him the cabin had been in my family for years, long before the HOA was even formed. My grandfather had built it himself, hand-cut logs, stone chimney, and all. It wasn't just a property to us. It was part of our history. My wife stood quietly beside me, still holding her military ID. She didn't need to say much. Her presence alone carried a weight that Karen didn't seem to understand. but I could see her patience thinning. Months of discipline and tense situations had taught her to keep calm. But it didn't mean she liked being treated like she didn't belong. The officer nodded slowly, looking around at the cabin, the surrounding trees, and the dirt road that led up from the main road. "This isn't under HOA jurisdiction," he said plainly. But Karen wasn't backing down. She started talking about how rules are rules and how this kind of thing sets a bad precedent for the neighborhood. She even pointed toward my wife's pickup truck, accusing it of being too loud and out of place. I noticed my wife shift her stance slightly, the same way she did when she was preparing to make a point she knew would land hard. There was a firmness in her eyes, a mix of quiet authority and controlled resolve. I knew she wasn't just going to defend herself. She was about to make sure Karen thought twice before pulling something like this again. And as she finally took a deep breath and opened her mouth, I realized the real confrontation was only just beginning. My wife stepped forward, closing the small space between her and Karen. Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight that made even the officer straighten slightly. She thanked him for coming, then looked directly at Karen. "I've served in places where the rules were the difference between life and death," she said quietly. "But here, on my husband's property, I don't need your permission to be home." Karen blinked, clearly not expecting her to speak so directly. She opened her mouth to fire back, but my wife held up her ID, again not to flaunt it, but to make it clear that she had nothing to hide. The gold lettering caught the last rays of sunlight, and I saw Karen's eyes flicker to it, then away, like she didn't want to acknowledge what it meant. The officer shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension was about to tip over. He asked if we wanted him to stay while we sorted things out, but Karen ignored him. Instead, she tried to turn the tables, accusing us of being disrespectful to the community and suggesting that maybe my wife's background made her think she could do whatever she wanted. That was the moment the air seemed to thicken. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the quiet hum of the forest around us now drowned out by the weight of what had just been said. My wife didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on Karen's, unblinking, her jaw set in a way I'd only seen a handful of times. Before moments, right before she took control of a situation completely. Karen's voice wavered just slightly now, as if she was starting to realize she'd stepped into something she couldn't manage. The officer's gaze moved between them, his hand resting near his radio, waiting. And in that charged silence, my wife took one deliberate step closer, ready to say the words that would change everything. Before my wife could speak, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the tense silence. Another vehicle appeared at the end of the drive, a dark SUV with tinted windows. It rolled to a stop, and two men in plain clothes stepped out. They moved with quiet purpose, scanning the scene the way trained eyes do. My wife's posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. She recognized them. Karen's confusion was instant. "Who are they?" she demanded, her voice sharper now, almost panicked. The officer turned, his brows knitting as he instinctively stepped to the side. One of the men nodded at my wife in a way that was both formal and familiar. "Ma'am, we were in the area. Heard there might be a situation," he said, his tone respectful but clipped. Karen's gaze darted between them, trying to piece together what was happening. Her earlier bravado faltered even more, but instead of backing down, she doubled down, demanding to know why government agents were showing up over a simple HOA matter. The man didn't answer her directly. Instead, he looked at my wife. "We still have that briefing scheduled for next week. I'll need you to confirm your availability." The way he said it wasn't casual. It hinted at something far more significant than a neighborhood disagreement. Karen froze, her mouth opening slightly as the realization began to creep in that my wife's background might be deeper than she ever imagined. But she still didn't seem ready to let go. "This is my neighborhood," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray the nerves beneath her stubbornness. The officer glanced at me, clearly unsure whether he should intervene or just let this play out. My wife, still calm, took another step forward, not toward Karen this time, but toward the SUV, leaving everyone wondering if this confrontation is about to turn into something much bigger than anyone expected. My wife stopped beside the SUV and turned back toward Karen, the officer, and me. Her voice stayed calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. You've been told this property isn't under HOA control. You've been told I live here. And now you've involved law enforcement without cause. She paused, letting each word hang in the air. This ends today. Karen opened her mouth, but the man from the SUV stepped forward. Ma'am, I suggest you listen, he said in a tone that left no room for debate. You've been interfering with someone who still works closely with the Department of Defense. That's not something you want to escalate. The officer shifted his weight, suddenly looking like he wished he had been anywhere else. Karen's defiance wavered, and for the first time, she